MythVision likes to dig for the truth. So today we have Dr. Aren Maeir joining us, who is a archaeologist, a professional archaeologist, and he knows a thing or two when it comes to the reality on the ground. We compare the Bible to archaeology. We talk about Israelite origins and the Exodus. We talk about the Philistine. How does this play into the history of reality and the text, the narratives that the Bible paints? We ask questions that I know you want answers to. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a special treat. We're going to be excavating some ideas here today. Am I even pronouncing that correctly? I hope I am.
Yes.
Dr. Aren Maeir, thank you so much for joining me. You are a world-renowned archaeologist. You are located in Israel. You have your hands, your feet, your sweat, your blood is all over these sites, I'm sure. And you've been exploring deeply into these topics. So I'm really appreciative of you joining us here at MythVision, and thank you so much.
Derek, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. I'm your host, Derek. I'm, a devout, serious investigator who's trying to figure out what the truth is. What is the reality of these things? When I say truth, I mean I'm looking for what maybe the data actually tells us. And of course, I know that there are stories, and we love narratives, and the Bible is one of the greatest of all time. And I really value that for what it is. I believe that most of it is narrative. At the same time, there might be a memory there. And we're going to explore this together. I'm hoping you stay tuned, because this is going to be one you're not going to want to miss. First off, I want everybody to go and check out Dr. Aren Maeir's books. One of the two that we really need to highlight is the Gath one right here. Can you tell us about the first one briefly, just a quick skim?
Well, that's the first volume of the reports on the excavation that I've been conducting at Philistine Gath, Tel Safi, for the last 25 years. So this reports on more or less the first 10 years of work. And then just last year, the second volume appeared, which reports on additional studies. And we have another one about to appear. And hopefully there will be 5, 6, or 7 volumes at the end to report all the finds that we've had. Now,
wow.
By the way, in addition to that, to the books that you're showing, there's about 300 additional articles that I've written. So, so anybody who wants to read my stuff, you have a lot of reading to do. So, and you have a lot to enjoy, but you can also a lot to critique.
Wow, thank you. I really highly recommend everybody go. I've listened to some of your lectures. You are funny as well, so I have to give you that. You really have a great personality as you're presenting these ideas, because some of these ideas, let's be honest, are very sensitive for some people. And I appreciate you, because while you recognize that, you're not going to falter your evidence to fit people's emotional desires or their psychological needs. You really want to give it to them straight. And so people are going to maybe adjust their thinking and realize maybe I should adjust the way I view these things, and still I can keep them as my, let's say people have an ontological need for this is their worldview. They can realize maybe this isn't what I thought it was, but it still has amazing value. So with that being said, I wanted to just give the benefit of the doubt. The first question I have is a general one in your work. You find out things all the time, and the Philistine are like a specialty of yours. But have you found any shocking discoveries or really interesting discoveries over the past year or two?
Yeah, I think so. Well, we've been excavating at Tel Safi Gath for 25 years. This last season was our last major season. We'll continue, but not large scale. And we've been working for 25 years, so you think you know the site very well. So this year, in the rather small season that we conducted because of COVID, we discovered a point in the city fortifications next to one of the gates where apparently the Arameans breached the city when they captured the city in around 830 BCE, because the Arameans, led by Hazael, the king of Aram Damascus, captured and destroyed Philistine Gath after a big siege. And we've had evidence of the destruction of the city, but we may now have the actual remains of where they breached and went into the city. So that was one very interesting discovery. And the other thing is, right below surface, right near the gate, we found a very large building, which we could have discovered any time during the 25 years that we had excavated, if we excavated at that specific point. And it's a large building, which might even be a temple. It's hard to say because we had interesting finds. And it was literally centimeters below surface. I mean, an inch or two below surface, and it was right there. And in fact, one of the interesting things that we have is that we have this enormous city. Gath is the largest city in the land of Israel during the 10th, 9th century BCE, more or less the time of David, Solomon, Ahab, that more or less that period. And it expanded from the upper tail of the city, the upper city, and to the north. And when Hazael destroyed that city, that area was never settled again. So we have this enormous area, flat area, where basically wherever we excavate, we immediately reach the Iron Age remains. So clearly, I'd have to excavate it for 150 years to be able to excavate that entire area, and I won't. What we've done is we've excavated a small sampling of areas, and on the other hand, we've done a lot of remote sensing using ground penetrating radar and magnetometry and other methods that give us a picture of what's below surface. So for example, this large building that we discovered this year, we saw through the magnetometry, and clearly we're not going to excavate the whole city. It's impossible, or maybe in future generations they'll do this. But so that was a very cool find that we had this year.
Wow, it's one of those things. I deal with the internet world where you hear people on each side. The Bible gets validated by archaeology, and the other side goes, archaeology buries the Bible. And it's like, okay, I guess it's like, what do you mean by it validates or not? And in one sense, listening to you, you're a breath of fresh air, because you're saying there are some validations, right? But then there's some archaeological finds that kind of, I guess you could say, in effect, debunk fundamentalist, literalist interpretations of some things and have to make us adjust our ideas if we want them to match the reality of what actually is on the ground. So maybe just a brief comment on how archaeology has been significantly good in our discoveries, and it kind of matches. It helps us kind of see that, yeah, there's some characters that really exist. There are some real things here. But also let us see, maybe there's some narrative. Maybe there's just some memory, narrative, cultural, mythology, whatever, if you don't mind.
Okay. Well, first of all, I always say that I don't have to prove the Bible, because I can move over to my shelf and pull down a Bible and hold it. It's there. The Bible is there. There's no question about it. I don't have to prove or disprove it. Second of all, I look at the Bible as an observant traditional Jew, as a book of significant religious ideological meaning, and that's what it was. It was written from the very beginning to be a text of meaning. Now, as a text of meaning, it was written for ideological purposes, and it wasn't written as a historical book as we know historical books today. Not to say that historical books are 100% objective, but at least nowadays we try to do that more. The Bible was written with a very, very specific agenda, mainly telling the history of the Jewish people, mainly telling the history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the people who lived in Jerusalem after the destruction of the First Temple. And I believe, following biblical research over the last 150 years, that the Bible was also created over a long period of time. Now, saying that it's created by a long period of time doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, dump any belief that it's inspired by God or something like that. That's possible to believe, but I think it was formed over a long period of time. And I think to a certain extent, we can look at the biblical text in a way similar to an archaeological tell, that it's made of layers upon layers upon layers of texts that have been formed and edited and played around with and put until the final form that we have today. And we have early texts, which may date in my opinion, to the early Iron Age. And we have later texts, which, for example, the book of Daniel, for all intents and purposes, is probably from the time of the Maccabees, the time of the Hellenistic period in the land. So we have a long expansion of times. Now, within those texts, there are texts which are completely ideological, have nothing to do with history, and there are texts that have a lot of historical information in them. And sometimes this historical information is extraordinarily clear. For example, if we deal with the conquest of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian, or the campaign of Sennacherib the Assyrian against Judah in 701. These are all things that are strictly historical, very, very clear. And even there, we have the Bible putting its ideological agendas in it. So I would say that what archaeology gives us is it enables us to paint a richer picture of the biblical text, because the Bible, here we talked about Gath. Gath was the largest city in the 9th century in the entire land. It was probably the most important kingdom in the land of Israel up until Hazael destroyed it. And when Hazael comes and destroys it, we have half a passage in 2 Kings 12, either 18 or 17, or depending on which version of the Bible you're reading, where he describes that he besieged Gath and took it. And he destroys the largest city in the land, probably besieged it for half a year, changes the whole geopolitics of the region. And then the Bible goes on and tells us, and then he went up to Jerusalem, and Joram, the king of Jerusalem, gave Joash, the king of Jerusalem, gave the temple treasures. Of course, that's what is important for the biblical narrative, not the overall geopolitical scene. So I think that we're getting a lot of information through archaeology that enables us to understand the biblical text better. Sometimes for example, based on ancient inscriptions, we can understand text better because there are all kinds of words which are unknown to modern people, and sometimes the biblical period texts or the archaeological remains enable us to understand these texts. Sometimes the archaeological finds give a different take on things. So, for example, how the Israelites appeared in the land, as opposed to the biblical story of a unified exodus from Egypt and traveling through the desert, coming in and capturing the land in one fell swoop. We have a different picture. But there are other things that we have a lot of correlation between. So I think it's not either or. It's a mixture of all kinds of things, and sometimes the biblical narratives fit the archaeological finds very well, sometimes less, sometimes they're opposite. But in general, the archaeological finds give us a nice picture on the bare bones of the biblical text, because the biblical text, it's a big book, but it doesn't tell us everything about, and it doesn't tell us how people lived always, etc. Now, listen, I'm in Jerusalem now. It's snowing now.
Wow, is it?
Yeah, well, it snowed last night. Now the snow is down on the ground. So this is something that occurs rarely in this region, and the same thing in biblical times. So when the Bible talks about snow, it's a unique phenomenon. So knowing the land, whether archaeologically or by knowing the geography and the climate of it, enables you to understand the Bible better. And that's what we're doing. And that's why, for example, I don't have any problem calling what I do biblical archaeology. Some people do, but I'm not out to prove or disprove the Bible by dealing with biblical archaeology. What I'm doing is I'm trying to use the archaeological remains to understand the cultures and peoples who live in the regions in which the Bible was formed. And this is both Israel, Palestine, Canaan, how you want to call it, but also Egypt and Syria and Mesopotamia, etc. A very broad region over a long period. Let's say from the Neolithic period till the Hellenistic period, and if you're including the New Testament, up until the Roman period and beyond.
You know, it's kind of interesting. There's some people who use the Bible as a map, like it has all the answers. And then there are others that seems like you're not putting it off and discarding it, but it's kind of like a spatula on the side in a way. It's kind of like, here's a possible tool that we can use, especially when you talk about Goliath, right? This word Goliath. We have no literary precedence where we were like, you know, in literature where we're like, oh yeah, we got this word Goliath. We know this. This helps us to see, as you were talking about in your excavations, that this name may have had, I guess, Proto-Indo-European or something else that was not Semitic, that it's coming in, a foreign language that we can actually find through archaeology, where there's another term. I can't remember the term. I'm just pointing out in your presentation. This is kind of the thing you're trying to point out, is the Bible, if it is completely made, like for people who want to just throw it away and say, no, that doesn't play any part, then why are we finding these phenomena? That's the interesting thing.
Well, I think what we have to do is we have to relate. I mean, from the point of view of a researcher, I have to relate to the Bible as a source which I use, and I use it critically. And there are things that fit with my finds, and there are things that don't. But it's not saying, well, since this is an ideological text, since it's made over a long period, I'm going to put this to the side, and I'm not going to relate to it all. And anything I do is going to be biblical free. And there are scholars who suggest it, and I think that's idiotic. If you don't mind learning French, I mean, because you use any resource that you have, even if the resource is complex. Listen, archaeology is complex. The archaeological remains represent only a very small portion of what actually existed, centuries or a millennia ago. I like to use the analogy. Imagine if you had a jigsaw puzzle with 10,000 pieces, but they only gave you 300, which didn't connect, and they didn't even give you the picture on the box. So that's about what we get in archaeology. We have a very limited amount of information about the past, and we have to try to recreate it. And we use all the methods possible. Now, if it was difficult, I would be an accountant.
Yeah.
I mean, if it was difficult and I gave up, I would be an accountant. It's difficult and it's enjoyable and it's a challenge. And any aspect of trying to learn about the past is a challenge. And I have to use the resources that I have, textual or other, as much as I can, recognizing their limitations, recognizing their complexity, and trying to weave it all together into a coherent picture.
What do you do? Final question on this. I'd love to move on to another subject matter. What do you do with archaeologists who are kind of evangelicals, and they're like serious archaeologists? They're credentialed. They are serious archaeologists, but there are limitations, as you spoke about, where the Bible. There are many places where you'll find maybe it does give us some evidence here, but then they go all the way, and they will find a way to make the Bible be the interpreter of the data so that it does not flop and it does not fail. You see what I mean? What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, anybody does what he wants to do. I'm not going to stop anybody from doing anything. That's not my job in life.
Right.
If you use the biblical text as your black and white, roadmap of what you're finding and what you're not finding, then I'll disagree with them. I will use all the resources at my disposal, and I'm not. And listen. If I was a historian dealing with the Middle Ages, and I had 3 texts, and one text was important to me from a national point of view, let's say I'm British, and I use the myths of King Arthur, and I relate to the myths of King Arthur as very, very central because they're important to me from a national point of view. Now, I'm not trying to offend anybody and say that the Bible is King Arthur's myths, but I'm saying if you have one text and you say that is the primary text and that is what's my basis, I think as a researcher, it's a mistake. You have to always compare your sources, and you have to be unabashedly critical towards everything, not towards the Bible only and say, oh, he's a Bible basher, don't pay attention to him. This is what sometimes the evangelical says. No, I'm a basher of everything. I'm critical of everything. I only use things after I look at them critically, whether it's the biblical text, what's at the archaeological remains, whether it's another report written by another archaeologist. I want to be critical. That's what a scientist has to be, is all the time critical, checking himself and checking others and rechecking yourself and rechecking others, and never accepting things just because someone said it. And I think that's the way we have to go.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Can you comment on the origins of Israel as a people? Where do you stand, I guess to be more specific on this particular one, where do you stand on the issue of early Israelite formation as it pertains to city dwellers or pastoral nomads, i.e., Dr. Finkelstein and Dr. Deaver, and their difference here? Where would you put yourself?
Well, I think it's more than Israel Finkelstein and Bill Deaver. There's three basic approaches to understanding the early Israelites. One is the traditional biblical explanation of an invasion led by Joshua, or someone who comes in and captures the various Canaanite cities, goes north, south, etc., and gets everybody gets the land. Then there's a second point of view, which is also hinted to in the Bible, for example, particularly in the book of Judges, that there was a process of slow settlement of non-sedentary pastoral elements, whether coming from outside the country or whether coming inside the country, and settling down in the marginal areas, slowly building up, the villages, and then eventually becoming a state. And then there's a third approach, which was originally started by two scholars by the name of Mendenhall and Gottwald, who claimed that the Israelites are in fact Canaanites who left the Canaanite cities and went into the highlands to, because they were running away for whatever reasons, to form this new group called the Israelites. Now, as always, life is not life white and black. It's always much more complex. It's either, you could even say it's gray, or there's the famous Jewish theologian and Rabbi Maimonides who say there's the golden path. It's like the middle is the golden path. So it's always a combination of different things. And I think the ancient Israel is comprised of a multitude of various people. Some people came from outside, some from the north, some from the south, some came from within the highlands. They were nomads who settled down at the time, and some came from within the Canaanite cities or culture. Now, why do I say that? Because when you look at the early Israelite remains, you can see cultural influences from all kinds of areas. This is embedded in the early biblical texts. This is embedded in the archaeological remains. This is embedded, for example, when you look at early Israelite religion, there's a lot of Canaanite aspects in early Israelite religion. So you have all kinds of influences coming from all kinds of places. Now, this also, it seems that this process was a much longer process than I thought. So, for example, the appearance of the Israelites is not something that just occurred around 1200 and then they were there and that's it. Rather, if you look at just take one aspect, the end of the Canaanite cities, the late Bronze Age Canaanite cities. So some cities of late Bronze Age Canaan ended yet in the 13th century. For example, Hatzor, the largest city in Canaan, apparently was destroyed somewhere around 1250. And then there's all kinds of cities. Many of them are abandoned or destroyed sometime in the 12th century. such as Lachish and Gezer and others. But, for example, Megiddo, one of the larger Canaanite cities, apparently isn't destroyed till somewhere in the mid-late 11th century BCE. That's almost 200 years later. So you have this long process in which the late Bronze Age world of Canaan is changing. And the same thing goes for the people in the highlands, in what we call the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. These people who we always call the Israelite tribes, they're settling down and going through a process. But who are they? Who is this name Israel? They're probably comprised of all kinds of small family groups, identity groups, who slowly coalesced, and at some stage, probably in the 10th or 9th century, form larger political entities, whether it's the Kingdom of Israel or the Kingdom of Judah. But I'll give you an example. The name Israel, that's an astounding problem, because it's mentioned once in the Merneptah stela from about 1210, when Merneptah, the king of Egypt, the son of Ramses II, tells us that, among other things, he destroyed the people of Israel, or it's spelled like Israel with an R at the end and not an L, because the Egyptians didn't have an L-like letter at that time, and that's the first mention. There's one other mention that someone suggested earlier, but nobody said that. And then Israel isn't mentioned till much later, and in fact, it's like we have hundreds of years of it's not being mentioned, and all kinds of other terms are used. And then, for example, Israel, the name is then taken on by the Judahites. So the whole use of this term Israel is very complex. So there probably were all kinds of other names of groups who formed in this region during this time. And again, I think they formed from a complex coalescence comprised of all kinds of local and foreign groups who came together. I think the traditions about Aram, for example, Jacob coming from Aram, might be reflected there. The traditions of coming from the desert, the traditions of coming from Egypt, the traditions of the Canaanite traditions, all this is mixed together in this very, very composite group, and when you look at the Israelite story, it seems to be a composite group.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I love this. It's way more complex for our average viewer who just wants the answer. Just give me the answer. So this next question's by my really good friend.
20 years, I'll give you the answer.
Give me 120, right? Just need a little bit longer, that's all. A couple lifetimes. My good friend, Dr. Joshua Bowen, actually formulated this question, and he's a wonderful friend. He wrote a book called The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. And his whole point was, he deals with a lot of fundamentalists and stuff. He loves the Bible. He also is an Assyriologist, so he loves getting into this stuff. And his point was, Derek, you see if you could ask him this simple question. It's because it's obviously simple. In dealing with some evangelicals or fundamentalist Christians, there are some arguments that attempt to explain the appearance of Philistine, I used to say. Philistine is how I actually was corrected by Dr. Maeir.
Each way is fine, yeah.
Yeah, it's the redneck little country southern boy in me that wants Philistine, but the Philistine in the book of Genesis, how would you address attempts to explain their appearance in Genesis as historically reliable, or maybe they're not? It's not historically reliable, and that Genesis dates till later. How do you address this?
Okay, well, this ties into all kinds of interesting questions. For example, what does the patriarchal narratives, what period does it reflect? Some people say it reflects early periods, the early Bronze Age, the Middle Bronze Age, the Late Bronze Age. Some people say it reflects various stages of the Iron Age. And for example, there's a lot of people who would claim that the patriarchal narratives reflect actually the period of the judges, the formation of the people in Israel. And then there are those who say that the priestly narratives are much later, from late the Iron Age or even post Iron Age. Now, in either case, when the biblical narrative is describing the region of the northwestern Negev, that's where Gerar is, that's where the story of Abraham against the Philistines is, that's a region that during the Iron Age, the Philistines lived there. So if the Philistines lived there, that means that if you want to describe this region so people will recognize it, so you describe it as Philistia, as Philistine territory, as a place where there's a Philistine king, and etc. So it's I think that most probably what you're getting here is, I'll tell you what, if you look at a Renaissance painting of a biblical scene, the people are dressed as people in the Renaissance. Why? Because if not, the people who in the Renaissance who were looking at the painting didn't understand what was going on. So if you talk about Abraham in the area where the Philistines live now, let's say I'm in the Iron Age, I'm in the 8th century, and I'm hearing a story about my patriarch Abraham, and he lives in the northwestern Negev. So that's where the Philistines live. Now the people who had the story did have access to text or sources that could tell them that actually there was a Canaanite kingdom at Haror, and that was the person who was there. They had there's no information on this, so they're trying to put it into terms that will make sense for the reader. Now, there have been people who said that the Philistines in the time of Abraham actually reflect evidence that we have of connections between the Minoan culture of Middle Bronze Age Greece, and there are some objects from the Minoan culture that have been found in the Middle Bronze Age sites of the northwestern Negev, but that doesn't fit in. We don't have any other evidence of groups such as the Philistines that live in this region in the Middle Bronze Age or in the Late Bronze Age. The Philistines as a cultural phenomena, as groups that came in or appeared in the very early Iron Age, are only during the Iron Age. You can't talk about Philistines before it. It just simply doesn't fit in with the archaeological remains. Now, you can say it, but there's no basis for it.
Simply put, thank you so much. I really appreciate that answer. My question is, and this is kind of a big can of worms we might rabbit trail into just for a little bit, is how did the Philistine play a role in the unification or formation of Israel as a nation? The biblical narrative plays it out as if the formation of Israel as a nation, in the particular most common sense, is that this is because of the Exodus from Egypt. But did the Philistines actually play the real role in this development, while the Exodus is kind of a foundation myth for the nation? So while I'm not discrediting cultural memory, and it's kind of like the snowball rolling downhill. It picks up another narrative, and this becomes a foundation myth, like Ronald Hindle. I've interviewed Dr. Hindle. Love him. He's awesome. My question is, with your archaeological work in the Philistine understanding, do you think that there's actually more reality to the development of Israel as a nation in their conflict or their interaction with Philistine, rather than this motif we see from the Exodus that they're being deported? I will admit, we know that Egypt was ruling these areas for a long time, so there's probably some impact here that still allows it to relate to their origins. But I wonder if there's more reality to the origins of Israel from Philistine interaction.
Okay, well, first of all, it's a great question, very complex, as you said. I don't think it's a can of worms, but it has a lot of aspects to it. Now, first of all, in the biblical text, we get the definite picture that one of the main reasons for the formation of the early Israelite monarchy, Saul and David, is due to the pressure from the Philistines. So even the biblical text, even if the biblical text reflects later memories of that period, we have a feeling that the Philistines were pressuring the early Israelite monarchies, and that or the Israelite groups, and that caused them to organize to try to form polities that could effectively counter the threat coming from Philistia. And we do know that in the 11th and 10th century BCE, the late Iron 1 and the early Iron Age 2A, the time which, if we go to according to a biblical chronology, would be right before and during the time of the United Monarchy. And I think there was a David and Solomon, as I don't think Solomon ruled an empire from the Euphrates to the Nile, but there definitely was a David and a Solomon. They had a small kingdom around Jerusalem, but there was a kingdom, and I think they were pressured by the Philistines. And for example, the city of Gath, which at that period is the largest fortified city in the entire land of Israel, probably was the most important and most powerful city-state in the region, and probably pressured the Israelites and the early Judites. I have no doubt about it. Now, on the other hand, the appearance of the Philistines culture, which in my opinion, some of them came by migration, some of them, by the way, were local Canaanites. They started to form as a culture around slightly before, slightly after 1200, which is just about the same time that the Israelites began to form, the Israelite culture in the highlands. So more or less at the same time, you have these groups starting to coalesce into the various identity groups and the polities that they later became. Now, in the early phases, the Philistines seem to have a more complex, technologically advanced, and organized society. So they probably had, in any altercation with the Israelites, an advantage. So it could very well be that we have a combination. Of the one hand, we have the processes that brought the Philistines and brought the Israelites to form their groups in the initial stage of the Iron Ages, and later on in the Iron Age, let's say 100 or 200 years later, because of the pressure of the Philistines towards the Israelites in other regions, maybe that caused the Israelites to start organizing into more, I would say, politically organized and coherent groups, which eventually led to the kingdoms, the northern and the southern kingdom, maybe a small united kingdom before that, but that was, I think, part of the reason for their formation was the Philistine pressure. I think there were other reasons as well, other things that were going on, because you have to remember the Iron Age, the early Iron Age, is a period in which it's sort of in dark ages. We sort of are living a period of 100, 150 to 200 years between the collapse of the late Bronze Age world in the entire Eastern Mediterranean and the appearance of the various small national states, Judah, Israel, Ammon, Moab, the various Aramean states, etc., around 10th, 9th century. And that lasts for a couple of centuries until the Assyrians appear. Now, all this was occurring, and it wasn't just because the Philistines and the Israelites. There was a wider picture going on here, and all kinds of things were going on, international trade and the threat from the Assyrians coming, and all this together was causing, things to move. But I do think that the Philistines had probably an important part in the background for the formation of the Israelite states, the Israelite kingdoms. Now, about the Exodus, I do agree. I think the Exodus is a combination of various memories from the past, and memories is a very complex issue. Very often people think of memories as, we have a memory in our head, and it's basically, if we can get to the right filing cabinet, we'll pull out that VCR and we'll be able to see what happened in the past. That's not what occurs. Every time you think of a memory, you change it. You remember some things, you forget some things, and you add some things. So the same thing goes for long-time historical memory. Now, the Exodus probably reflects all kinds of aspects of the past of the Israelites and people that they associated with, and probably at some point the Israelites chose to focus on one aspect of the Israelite memory, because if we're saying the Israelites came from all kinds of places, so for some reason they chose to accentuate the part of coming from Egypt, or some will say to invent the part. I don't think they invented. I think there was a small component that came from Egypt, and some have suggested very interestingly that the Levites, the part of the priests, many of them have Egyptian names. So maybe that's one of the portions of Israel that came from Egypt. And for some reason, that was turned into the central facet of the formation of Israel. And there's a very nice term called invented pasts. That means that a country, a group will take memories from the past and make it meaningful for their present. And very often what happens is a group will take something and accentuate it. A very nice example is when you look at the coronation of a king in England. Recently, not too long ago, we had one of the princes married. Now, you think all these things are something that go back to the time of at least Henry VIII. This is how they've been doing it in England. And it turns out from historical studies, it's all stuff that was invented in the 19th century, thinking that this is what should have been done in the past, and now that's become the long-term British history of things. So I think the same thing goes for things like Exodus. There is some historical kernel from it, and at some point, that historical kernel was accentuated and preferred over other aspects of the story.
I do think it's interesting factoring in like documentary hypothesis and stuff, like people who will say, look at the different stories that the redactor put together. I mean, some are actual contradictory. So your position there is quite interesting. If we take the archaeology and were to, let's say, overlay this idea to the text, some redactors saw many voices probably. No, you better keep our Amalekite memory there that Joseph was sold by the Amal. No, you got to keep the Ishmaelites. And and they kept the traditions, even if they contradicted, because we don't, that's anachronistic, I think. Like, who is Moses' stepfather or father-in-law, right? Is it Jethro or is it?
Take into account that very often in ancient texts, they didn't mind adding things. In ancient, when an ancient scribe would recopy a text, he had no problem adding in or changing because he thought he's doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. So I think our concept of the pure ur text, the ancient text, and how it should be, etc., is something that was not a problem at the time. So if we had all kinds of things, we'll put it together, and that's what we have, and deal with it.
I like that Levite point you brought up. That's really interesting because, priests seem to be the central focus of a lot of this literature. I mean, it seems like they're the ones who have a special type of religion as well, whereas the common folk have their shrines and idols to all these different gods, even altars where they shouldn't, as I've seen Dr. Deaver kind of show these things. They've got their Asherah pole, all sorts of fun stuff, I guess you could say, looking at it. But I wondered if, and I'm throwing this out there, this might be like, you're way off, but that's okay. Some people like to think there's a memory with this Hyksos Egyptian exile. And I just wondered if maybe one of these groups settled and finally they left Egypt and they were like, you know what, here's another memory, without being literally historically true. Because if you try to take the Hyksos expulsion as it literally was, no, that doesn't fit the narrative and the data. It doesn't fit. But they would have been priest-like. They would have known a lot of the high-functioning religious, these religious cultic practices. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've written about this. I think that my opinion about the Exodus is a combination of memories of connections between the people who lived in Canaan or Israel and Egypt over many, many periods and centuries. So, for example, one of the groups who went from Canaan to Egypt and then eventually were kicked out are the so-called Hyksos, and so that might have created one level of a stratum of memory about leaving Egypt. And then there were connections between Israel and Egypt throughout the Late Bronze Age and throughout the Iron Age. So I think there's a lot of various memories. Now, peoples cultures have an extraordinary ability to remember long-term memories, selected, and that they don't remember the whole picture. And there are in Australia the native Aborigines, the so-called Aborigines, have what's called the dream time, where they tell stories, and some of the stories have been shown to relate to geological events thousands of years ago. Mm. So they're remembering an event and they're telling the story over and over, and oral histories have an extraordinary ability to recount information. And it doesn't have to be accurate, but nevertheless, you do remember something that occurred, and you're passing this on, and you'll pass it on for 100 years or 500 years or 1,000 years. And then the person who will be telling that story 500 years later will then add in something that occurred in his time. And then 500 years later, you'll have the story combining the two, because how can you even differentiate between them? So I think the Exodus stories really reflects many strata of memories of connections between Egypt and Canaan, Egypt and Israel throughout many, many centuries and millennia.
Wow. What is the oldest, if I could maybe, you may not know the answer to this, but if it'd be fun to get your thoughts about where you personally stand. What is the oldest data that we can archaeologically match biblically to some degree, even if it's not like, here is the Xerox, this is actually the case exactly? You talk about in some of your lectures and in your writings, I've read a few of your articles just to get a little hint at some of the stuff you deal with. And we can see, some of these prophets existed, some of these kings. You talked about David and Solomon existing, but I'm using like people existing kind of sort of idea here. Moses, Abraham, did they actually have to exist? Like, where in your thinking?
Well, we don't have any text that mentions Moses or mentions Abraham. But for example, the name Moses is an Egyptian name. So people have given explanations of the meaning of it from an Egyptian point of view. The name Abraham is a Semitic name, and we do have early texts that mention similar names. So, but we don't have, I had a teacher in the Hebrew University who would say, Abraham didn't exist, but his cousin Abraham exists. So they fit in with the cultural environment we know of. Now, the earliest figure that we can appears in an ancient text, an extra biblical ancient text, is David. David is mentioned not as from a text of his period, but from 150 years or so later. The Tel Dan stela, written in Aramaic, probably by Hazael, the king of Aram Damascus. He put up a stela apparently when he captured the city of Dan in northern Israel. And among other things, he mentioned that he killed the king of the house of David. So 150 years, more or less, after the time of David, it tells us that people in that region recognize the kingdom of Judah as having a founding figure by the name of David. So that's the earliest figure that we can talk about that appears in a biblical text. And then we have mentions of Ahab, and one of the most important kings of the kingdom of Israel, and other figures going down the line, along the way. And I would say the later on you go in the Iron Age, the more we have figures that are mentioned. And this goes for figures mentioned in Assyrian texts, figures mentioned in epigraphic inscriptions found in the land of Israel, whether the various seals, the bullae, or the actual seals and other inscriptions. And then there's once you go into let's say from the 9th century onwards, there's such a nice correlation between at least the general scheme of history and periods and kings that we get from the biblical text and the extra biblical finds, that there's no problem with that. It's not an invented history at that point. Now, once you start going back in the 10th and 11th and 12th and earlier periods, that's where some things are completely unclear. But it's not that some people say, well, the whole history, the whole biblical text is all invented, and there's nothing historical about it, and it's more or less like reading Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that, but rather, from a certain point onwards, the framework of history, of events, of people, of kings, etc., that's portrayed in the Bible fits in well with the extra biblical text. It doesn't mean that, for example, in the biblical text, it tells us that Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem, ruled by King Hezekiah, and then for some miraculous reason, the Assyrian army left, and an angel of God came or something like that. Now, that's not what happened. We have other texts which tell us a different story, but it doesn't mean that it's not denying the historical framework that's presented in the biblical text. It's just giving us other or more details that then the biblical text gives us.
Wow. I'm reminded of a comment made from another guy, Russell Gamirkan is his name, and he made this connection, for example, where Shalmaneser III, there's like a list of his riches and what he had with golden chariots and this and that, and it looks a lot like the list given to King Solomon, whereas reality, maybe they saw these other people and said, we got to give our king our fame and compare, there's this like competition of narrative that you might be like, no, we want our king to rule this huge monarchy, and David ruled this. They kind of embellish the past.
Well, I think there was embellishment of the past. Everybody embellishes the past. If you look at George Washington, and any story of even a relatively recent past is embellished, and probably when describing a king such as Solomon, so you described him as some major emperor, like we know from the Assyrian or Babylonian or Persian Empire. That's true. On the other hand, you have to be careful not to think that the biblical the people who wrote the Bible, the various places that it was written, knew Assyrian and knew Babylonian, read the old text, etc. Copied things. It's I would say it's probably more complex than that, but I definitely think there is a lot of influence from the Assyrian, from the Egyptian, from the Babylonian, from the Persian cultural words that do reflect, and also, and if you're talking about Russell Mirkin, also from the Greek world, that do reflect in the biblical text at various stages.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I am highly impressed with this. This has been a blast, and I hope that we can have you come back to take a deep dive. We're coming upon our hour here soon, and I didn't want to, I didn't want you to go, it's that guy again. Oh, he wants to go on and on. So once again, everybody needs to go get the Gath. Is it Gath? Am I pronouncing that right?
Gath, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there's
you got to go to Gath. Yeah,
you got to go. Hey, you got to go there. Seriously, go get this book if you want to really educate yourself and look at what's on the ground.
This is, I would say, there's two issues of Near Eastern archaeology, which is a slightly more popular oriented text. Two issues from the end of 2017 and 2018, which have a whole slew of articles on the excavations. And by the way, if you go to my website, that right over there, so first of all, there's a lot of pictures and stories and jokes about what goes on in the text, but there's also a lot of resources of how to read about the what we do on the site. So I highly recommend you go there. And finally, I'll make a plug. I have an online course in biblical archaeology, what's called a MOOC, a massive open online course, which is through the edx.org platform. And it's actually running now till the beginning of March. And if you want it's 8 lessons in which you get an introduction to archaeology and to the archaeology of ancient Israel and Judah. Highly recommended. Take it. You'll have a great time. So
is it on here on this website?
Well, if you go, go into a new, and write in edx.org, biblical archaeology, and you'll get to it.
So we just go here and
Biblical
archaeology.
Let's go in the search window.
Oh, sorry. Biblical archaeology.
Yeah, you see it there, right in there.
See what we have. Okay, and then this is it. Start and roll.
That's running there, and this is its, I believe, its 5th run, and it's going on till March 2nd, if I'm not mistaken. So you still have a month and a bit, if you're interested in going on, and even after it's the running, you can go into it. It's archived. It's a lot of fun. I highly recommend it, and so far about 9,000 people throughout the world have taken it, and everybody's enjoyed it.
That's awesome, and you're running it, so everybody has to go check that out. Oh, you can go and join the course, of course, and please go down in the description. All of these links will be down there for you to access it. I really want you to come back. That's why I don't want to burn this candle out. I want to give you the opportunity to go. This was fun. So
okay, we'll think of something to talk about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maeir. Everybody watching, let us know what you think down in the comments section. Tell us your thoughts. Maybe you have some interesting questions. Consider joining MythVision's Patreon, because if you do, you can actually go and help support us. You can write me your questions. I'd be happy to try and take them maybe for the next interview that we have. A lot of these interviews are not made public. They are there specifically for you and eventually might find their way to YouTube. There's no telling how long. But this video, once you see it on YouTube, like I said, go write me messages. And the next time we meet up, I will ask your questions to Dr. Maeir and see what he has to say. Can't promise you he's going to tell you what you like to hear, but he's going to do his best to tell you what he thinks. You are wonderful. And I'll be in Israel in October, by the way. So maybe
COVID allowing, yeah.
Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen, but I might be over there with Dr. James Tabor, and he wants to show me some places that Jesus may have walked and all that cool stuff. So I look forward to maybe possibly, we don't know. We'll see. Maybe bumping into you.
Okay, great. Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay, and ladies and gentlemen, don't forget, we are MythVision.